Welcome, everybody. So this is Pat Wright. Pat, I met for the first time last year at PGConf. Turns out we have a number of things in common behind the scenes. He was a member of the PASS board for a number of years, so if you use SQL Server and know the PASS community, Pat has been a part of that for a long time. As a leader of conferences and database and now Postgres conferences and other tech stuff out in Utah, and really an awesome ambassador for the community in general. So I'm excited for this. It's good stuff, especially coming from SQL Server. So.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. I wasn't expecting an intro, so I appreciate that. So what we're going to talk about today is PostgreSQL for the SQL Server DBA. So the whole goal and around this presentation that I want to talk about is that if you've just come into a Postgres situation and you were previously from SQL Server, even if you're from Oracle, I'm going to give you some of the basics of what you need to know about Postgres going forward. This is not going to be a huge deep dive into the very differences between Postgres and SQL Server. That's something actually my friend Ryan here is going to be doing at the PASS Summit, and other people have done too as well. This is really to get you started, to get you feeling more comfortable. 4.5 years ago, I did this in my own job. I went from a SQL Server situation, I moved to another company, they were entirely Postgres, I had to learn Postgres, I had to learn Linux, I had to learn everything about that situation, and this presentation is a direct relation to that. So that's what I'm really going to talk about today, and it's all about getting you comfortable. So please don't expect me to sit here and say this index is different than that one. That's what I'm going to show about today. So, all right, just a little bit about me really quick. Ryan kind of gave a great intro, but yes, I've been working with data for a long time. I've been a SQL Server MVP, a SQL Server board member. I've also been using Postgres now for about the last 4.5, 5 years. I've done a lot of big data work as well, stuff in Elasticsearch, Hadoop, Hive, and Spark. So I've been around on a lot of different technologies. I do consult on the side with MySQL, SQL Server, and Postgres, so I kind of do a little bit of everything. You can usually ask me about any databases, and I'll have some sort of good recommendation around them. And then I've started the blog again finally, so you can find it at wrightdatabaseconsulting.com or WrightDB Consulting. This little QR code will go to it as well. You'll see in my presentations I use QR codes because it's a great way for you to just get a link and go do something, okay? So, but that way also on the recording, you'll be able to see that later on too as well. So as we go through this presentation, please, please, please interrupt me with any questions. Do not wait till the end. Okay, raise your hand. I know Ryan may need to bring the mic, but don't worry, I will repeat the question and stuff for the recording, but please interrupt me while we're doing this. I love interactive sessions, and I love for you to add on to the session with whatever you found as well. So, without further ado, we're going to talk about the accidental DBA. That's what we call people that pick up a database and get started with it, but they may have either no database knowledge or they don't have knowledge of that database that they're currently working on. Like someone that was in a SQL Server position and went to a Postgres position. Now, you're asking to yourself, Pat, why are you showing rocks in a picture? I mean, what is this got to do with anything? I am an accidental gardener and landscaper for my house, and this is the rock project I did this summer. So that's why you're seeing rocks up on my slides. So where this is really geared to, where the accidental DBA comes in place is that perhaps you're a sysadmin, perhaps you're a DevOps person, perhaps you're a Oracle database administrator, and now you're going to get into Postgres. That's what this is really for, and that's who we're talking to for the accidental DBA. That's what we call it. Or if you're completely brand new, like you came out of college and nobody teaches database administration in college, right? We've never seen a DBA job in college, and then this is how you do, and this is what you should do for it. So that's what this is really about. All right, and we're going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about basically your first 7 days. That's how we're going to take this. We're going to talk about my friend Abby. My friend Abby is a really great database person. He's been using SQL Server all of his life, and now he's getting into Postgres. So what are some of the things that he needs to know getting into that very first day? What should he do whenever he comes into that position? Well, and the first thing you should know is, okay, your boss comes to you and it says, well, we just got this new application. It uses Postgres in the back end. We need you to manage it and take care of it. Well, the first thing you ask is, how do I connect to it? What do I do? How do I connect to it? Now, I'm also going to make the assumption during this presentation that a lot of what you're going to be dealing with is already in Windows, because SQL Server is very much a Windows world. So a lot of my references, a lot of my talk and discussion will be about Windows. This doesn't mean that Windows is the only place you can run it, but it'll be a very common thing that we're going to see. And I'm going to show some of my samples here will be showing on Windows Postgres Edition, but I will be 100% frank. Postgres is almost always run on Linux, okay? 4.5 years ago, when I started on Postgres, we literally looked at Postgres for Windows, and the community literally responded and said there's not a single installed instance of production Postgres on Linux. Now that has changed. That has definitely changed. There's plenty of Azure instances out there and Citus instances and all sorts of stuff. But please believe me when I say you're going to be dealing with Linux, okay? So we'll talk about that a little bit. But so how do we get started? How do we get connected to our Postgres instance? So this is the connection screen from PGAdmin. Now I'm going to use GUI tools as well. Everybody will say, well, go to PSQL, go to PSQL. Hold the phone. If you are a Windows admin and you are not used to Linux or PSQL, go to the GUI first, okay? I do not like PGAdmin. I'll talk about different tools in a minute. But definitely go to a GUI tool. You're going to feel a lot more comfortable leaving your comfy SQL Server management space and going into PGAdmin or something else, okay? So this is the general connection, just very similar to what you see in Management Studio. You have a name and address. You have a different ports. You're going to have to get used to 5432, not 3433. It's just a different number. That's all you got to remember. The other big thing that you'll need to know is that Postgres likes to manage really by users and roles. Okay, so there's not going to be Windows authentication. Let me rephrase that. There will not be Windows authentication to Postgres. There is this wonderful little checkbox here for Kerberos authentication. I have yet to find a Kerberos authenticated Postgres server. Okay, so don't believe it. It might be out there, but don't believe it. If anybody else has found it, great. I would love to hear about it. So you're going to be using a username and password. You're probably going to have someone else set it up. There are super users out there, just like an SA for SQL Server, so that's out there and available. Of course, it's the same rules. Don't use your super user. Grant another user as super user or something else. Don't use that specific super user. But know that it is out there and you can do it. But do not expect things like Windows authentication, Windows management, any of that to work when you're connected to your Postgres. Even if you're talking about Windows Postgres Edition. Okay, you're probably not going to do it through Windows authentication. So expect a username, expect a password, host name, and all of that stuff, okay? All right. Other questions on connecting. The other one that I run into a lot is this tab up here for SSH tunnel or SSL. You run into that a lot too because you are possibly tunneling into Linux servers to get to wherever you're going. So there's a lot of the times either somebody's running a VPN or they're doing a direct tunnel through terminal services to actually get to it. So do not be surprised if your connection has to use an SSH tunnel as well, which usually requires an SSH key. Again, these are things that you don't normally see in Windows too much, but you see in Linux all the time. It's very common, right? And I can't go in depth into all the tons of things about Linux that are different. Just know that they're very different. How many people here are Linux users on a day-to-day? Okay, so we've got a few. And how many of you, though, feel really comfortable in Windows, though, too? Okay, so good balance between both, knowing both, but keep that in mind that they're very different in what they do. Okay, so now we've got connected to the database. We're there, and again, we'll talk about GUIs and everything else in just a second, but then the most important thing, what do you do on the second day? You say, how in the world do I back this database up? Or where is my backup so I can test it and make sure I can restore it? Because the truth of any matter is you've never backed up your database unless you've restored it, right? If you haven't tested your restore, you haven't backed up. It's just a danger. So, and I thought this picture was very fitting. This was outside my hotel Tuesday night when a certain individual was coming into town. There were these trucks everywhere. And what better way to say PG dump than a dump truck, right? So let's talk about backups and how different they are between SQL Server and Postgres, because keep in mind, they are different, okay? This was one of the biggest shockers to me when I got started. When I got started, we had a process out there that was dumping the database. And I'm like, that just sounds horrible. I'm like, why are we dumping our database every night? And then they showed it to me. Not only is it dumping it down to a text file, essentially, you replay it by pointing it back into the database as a text file. I'm like, this seems so horrible to me. Coming from SQL Server manages its files in basically it has an MDF file format. So SQL Server manages its own files inside there. Postgres does not. Postgres uses the Linux file system to manage its files and tables. So because of that, you are literally really just copying data to another file inside Linux. That's what a dump is kind of doing. It's accessing the data and then dumping it down to another part of the system, essentially. Whereas in SQL Server, it's really managing its own files, it's managing its own process, so it can compress, it can do all those sort of things inside there. One's not better than the other. I'm just saying they're two very different ways of doing it.
But SQL Backup will also create another file, right?
Yes, SQL Backup will also create another file, 100%. It's just it will be in a format that you can't necessarily open and look at. Yeah. If you actually take a Postgres dump, you can open it up and read it, essentially.
Doesn't PGDump have this binary format too?
They do, yes, absolutely. You can dump it into a binary format, which is a good way also to get kind of a little smaller format, a little faster as well. But I think you'll find that there's a lot of people out there that don't necessarily do the binary format too. So, I mean, it's back and forth. But there are other tools as well, because then you get into talking about a base backup. Now, a base backup is very important because in Postgres, a base backup is the entire server. So it's not just really one database. That's another big distinction that I had to figure out from SQL Server to here. A base backup does the entire directory, saying this entire Postgres server is now backed up to another location. That's what a base backup does. It copies all of it to another location. In SQL Server, you don't really have that concept of doing your entire server. You always back up each database individually. You never really back up the whole server, whereas a base backup, it does. It backs up the entire server. Every schema, every database, everything on there. Okay? Takes a little bit longer, but it's also a great way to completely back it up. And you use this all the time for failover or other things like that. So when you come into this new situation with Postgres, make sure you understand what kind of backups you are taking, a base backup or a dump. And then you get into others, there's third parties out there. Stephen and I were just talking about this yesterday, PG Backrest. PG Backrest is another way, again, to do a method of backing up the database that's a third party being another tool that you could use to back up Postgres. So there's other tools out there. There was other tools for SQL Server available too, but they all base themselves in Linux. I mean, Postgres bases everything inside Linux. Okay? Everything is files inside Linux. There's no, the best way to put it is in SQL Server, you have an internal operating system that interacts with the disks and the drives. In Linux, you do not have that internal operating system. You have simply direct access to Linux talking to it from Postgres. Does that make sense to everybody? That's a really, really big difference to keep in mind as you're going through this in your thought process. SQL Server built kind of an OS there to keep them separated. Postgres is directly connected to Linux to write that data. And it is true in Windows too. When Postgres for Windows writes, it talks directly to Windows to do that. It does not have a layer in between there. And maybe the code guys will say there is kind of a layer, there's an abstraction of whatever, but it's not to the level of SQL Server that actually is completely abstracting it out. So this is also very important to know in the future when we talk about wall log a little bit and we talk about some other things. It's kind of hard to expand drives sometimes. You know, you can expand a Linux drive, but you can't really move a database to another drive easily unless you literally like dump it and then reload it. In SQL Server, you could always add another file and it could start growing on another drive and stuff. You can't add another file easily to Postgres. It's a little bit harder. You can move some tables and partitioning schemes and things like that, but it's not a simple thing of just, hey, add a file to this drive and start pushing things over to that drive. It's a lot simpler in a SQL Server world than a Postgres world. So it's something to keep in mind as you're going through this. Last thing I'll mention here too on this one is scheduling. There is no SQL Server job scheduler. There's no SQL agent in Postgres. Most of the time, most of the people I've dealt with are using cron tabs inside Linux. So they typically are using crons to do PG dumps, PG backrest, anything else. Any of those things, PG base backup, it's all done through crons, okay? That means that you're gonna need to learn bash on top of that, most likely. Bash or something else that will run in your cron tabs well. You're gonna have to learn about cron tabs and what they are. Again, these are all things, when I started in my Postgres journey, I knew nothing about cron. Not at all. So I had to learn cron while I was doing this and figure all these things out. It's not difficult. I will say there's a wonderful site out there called Cron Tab Guru. If you want to figure out the times to run crons, just go to that site. Don't try to memorize the numbers and everything else. I know several people that know those numbers by heart, but I'm like, no. I'm going to go to this website, type in what I want, and it tells me exactly what to put on the line. So Cron Tab Guru, best friend. But yeah, there's no scheduling built into Postgres. Now, there are some extensions out there. There's one called PGCron that puts a cron tab essentially inside the database. It puts it into tables, puts in scheduling, that sort of thing. So you do have some scheduling internal to Postgres with extensions. Out of the box, though, there's not any scheduling inside it. So keep that in mind as you're going through and forward with these things. Okay, questions on backups? Notice I didn't really talk about restores. Again, keep in mind on restores, you need to test them. A dump restore is usually a lot slower than a PG-based backup as well. Because keep in mind what a dump is doing. A dump is literally putting the data down into a file, and then you basically are inserting it back into the database. You're literally saying insert into this table, this table, this table, so forth. It's going through that. So it takes a long time. And it re-adds the indexes, the foreign keys, everything. It puts all that back. A base backup simply copies the directory and puts the directory back in there and then says start. So a base backup is a lot faster for recovery than a dump, okay? So if you're out there and you're doing dumps, keep in mind your recovery time can be 2 or 3 times longer sometimes if you're not careful. We found that in ours. We started to move to PG Backrest. The other tool out there is Barman. Barman is a common one as well that a lot of people use. We went to Barman with one of our tools. We actually think we would have preferred Backrest, but we got Barman working, so it went to that way. They basically give you some incremental capabilities inside there when you start doing Backrest and Barman. They give you more features and capabilities than just base backup. Okay, other questions? Good, all right. So now let's start talking about how it looks when things start to actually change. This is exploring, this is saying, okay, now we've gone from one thing to another. What has actually changed about my system? Where are my tables? Where are my schemas? Where are my stored procedures? The good news is that most of it is somewhat the same. There's some fundamental things that you need to know the differences of. So probably the biggest one, and I'll bring this up so that we can see it here. This is, over here on the side, this is PG Admin. And over here, this is SQL Server Management Studio. So probably one of the biggest things that I ran into more than anything else is that to Postgres, a schema, bless you, to Postgres, a schema is a lot closer to a database in SQL Server, okay? So you have databases in Postgres, but typically your schemas are actually closer to what you would think of as a database inside SQL Server. So you have to flip your mind when you do this, is that, like, let's say you wanted to create 5 or 6 databases on your Postgres system, you're probably going to create one database and multiple schemas underneath it in most cases. Again, this is depending on how your application is architected, but from what I've done in the past, 9 times out of 10, a schema is a lot more like a database in SQL Server than an actual database in Postgres, okay? And this is my experience of running into it. We found that schemas worked a lot better when we think about SQL Server, we treat them as schemas, not databases. Okay? Because one of the big things on Postgres is you can't really cross databases. Like in SQL Server, you would say join to database.dbo.users. No problem whatsoever. Postgres, absolutely not. Cannot be done. You cannot cross those two at all. You have to literally unconnect or connect to another location and do it again like you're connecting to a server all over again. A schema, you can. You can do that, the naming sequence. But a database, you cannot. So if you're coming from SQL Server, that naming, that full part UNC naming path is a lot harder if you put them as databases and not schemas. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's something to keep in mind. It's something that had a hard time on me because I wanted to create new databases in Postgres all the time. I'm like, just create another database. And then I'm like, well, can't you just join between here? No. Postgres said, nope, you cannot join. Do not touch this. You're not allowed to go over there no matter what you do. And I'm like, okay. So you need schemas. And in my current position, we actually have 1 or 2 databases, and they usually have about 10 to 11 schemas underneath them. So they're treated much more like a database underneath there than an actual database itself. So,
And this is actually what we're doing in Babelfish and AWS for SQL Server, which kind of teaches Postgres to speak physical. So because you have this separation between databases and Postgres, so in Babelfish we create one Postgres database, and inside we create different schemas to simulate the SQL Server databases.
Yeah. So to reiterate for the camera, what you're mentioning is Babelfish has that same concept and idea. It creates one Postgres database and then many schemas so that it looks like a SQL Server would, because people normally in SQL Server are used to saying database.dbo.table and just join right across them. If you do that in Postgres, it'll only work if they're schemas, not if they're databases. So, and again, this is not even a permissions thing. If you try to grant permissions across the schemas, it won't let you do it. Postgres, we had scripts in Bash where we created a DBA database and we had a general application database. The DBA database, the scripts in Bash had to connect once for the DBA database and a completely different server connection for the actual application database. So there's a big difference between them. And it's something to keep in mind whenever you're looking at stuff. So other big key things inside here, the other one that I gotta mention heavily, so tables are still tables. You're not gonna have a problem there. Most of the things that you're gonna look at on tables are very, very similar. As a matter of fact, I typed create table here to create one of my tables. I took the same create table statement and basically put it in Postgres. That wasn't that different on syntax. There are different features, partitioning and schemas and things like that, but your general everyday create table, insert, those sort of things, they're gonna work the same, okay? They're not gonna be drastically different. Procedures and functions will, and they will infuriate you. So stored procedures in SQL Server, we love to put logic inside stored procedures, whether it was right or wrong, we did it. And we liked to have loops, and we like to have variables, and we like to have all of these things, and none of those are in Postgres. Okay, sort of. There is what's called do commands inside Postgres that you can do this. Now, I skipped over one thing. So what I'm showing here, let me make that a little bigger. What I'm showing here, this tool is called DataGrip, okay? It's made by JetBrains. This is one of the GUIs that I strongly suggest. I like this one. It is the closest one I found in Management Studio to get myself comfortable with it. dbeaver is another excellent one too as well. I know a ton of people that use dbeaver. PGadmin is what I showed earlier was kind of the default view, and it's what comes bundled with Postgres. It's just not the level of tool as Management Studio, okay? Now keep in mind, it's never gonna be the level of tool as Management Studio because they had an entire team, department, and millions of dollars to work on it. But I strongly suggest if you need something similar to what Management Studio was, a DataGrip or a dbeaver are your best friends. There is a license cost to this. You do have to buy it, absolutely. dbeaver, I think, is free. Maybe not. There might be a cost to it. It's free?
You need to buy the license for both, and they're expensive. Like, the DataGrip is not cheap.
I don't think it's that bad, but when you're a consultant and you have it part of it, then it's not that bad. But you're right, there is a cost to it. But for me, DataGrip has been a really helpful tool to move from something like Management Studio. It gave me IDE interface, it gave me savings of files, it gives me everything I need in one place. So even if you only do it for a certain amount of time, find dbeaver, find your DataGrip, find whatever it is, but go to a GUI tool because I kind of tried to start straight into P-SQL and everything else, and it was that much harder, okay? It's really a lot easier if you can do something like this from here. So, okay, so that's the tool. I'm gonna show really quick just down here. So this is a standard kind of create procedure. This is nothing special or anything. It's just everything that you would see in SQL Server. You're declaring variables, you're doing stuff. I'm not gonna go through the whole thing. The same similar procedure here in Postgres, and this is actually a bash script, it's not a procedure, but this is what you're gonna see right here. See this little do statement that you have right here? I'll make that a little bigger still. These screens aren't that giant. So this little do statement here is where you can kind of declare variables a little bit inside Postgres, and you can do some of that work. But to say that it's as simple as what we did inside stored procedures is not the right word. It's kind of very different and complicated, let's put it that way. We found ourselves, whenever we wanted to write something that was heavily procedured or variables or anything, we went out to Bash. We actually went to Bash, wrote our code inside Bash mostly, and then passed it into direct SQL statements and made them simpler. And we found that we could do that work a little better than what we did inside functions. Now, in my current job, they put entire business logic, as in like the entire world, inside functions. So I have now seen functions that are literally 10,000 lines long of entire business logic inside Postgres, okay? Inside the database, which is bad. Why? Why? Because it's very complicated to figure out and unravel. I did miss your presentation, yes. Yes, we'll have to talk after, Henrietta. We'll have to talk after. So my point is that in SQL Server, we saw it very simple to do things like declare and stuff like that. In Postgres, that's not really the same thing for procedures. Now also keep in mind that in Postgres, A function is much more like a procedure in SQL Server, okay? So they call them functions much more. Functions have input-output. They have things, they do things inside it. A stored procedure in Postgres does not have output, so it doesn't really have it the same thing as what you had in SQL Server. So they're kind of backwards in their naming, and backwards depending on which way you're looking at it. But the point is they're two different things. So don't equate a stored procedure in Postgres to the same stored procedure in SQL Server. You should really equate a function in Postgres to a stored procedure in SQL Server. Does that make sense? So when you see a lot of functions in a database, those are more stored procedures from SQL Server. I love naming, right? We all love naming things differently that mean the same thing. Makes it very easy to transfer it to other databases. Okay. Questions on functions and stored procedures or any of these other items here? No. Okay. So now, let's say that we're actually talking about what's going wrong on my server. So now we've found our server, we've connected to it, we've explored it a little bit, we understand that everything that we knew previously is now backwards and we don't know anything. That's not totally true, but we know something. So now what do we do when, hey, server's down, or I can't connect to the server, or the server seems like it's really, really busy? How do we look at that? In SQL Server world, this was standard with who is active. You would definitely go out and you'd say SP who2, or you'd say who is active, or any flavor of tools that are out there. There is tons and tons of third-party tools out there to look at. Postgres does have an activity listing as well, just as well. This same thing right here. You can see a general everyday statement. This one is kind of just a simple one that I use all the time. It doesn't have to be like this. A lot of people modify this. They come up with other things. But I didn't find like one SP who is active out there. There's some PG tools out there that are wonderful. There's a great GitLab repository out there of PG tools that have a lot of great scripts inside it. We found this was our most common thing to use to go look at activity, to see what's currently going on in the server. PGAdmin does come up with a dashboard as well, right here. So PGAdmin kind of brings you in a dashboard as well, just when you're looking at it. It talks about locks and connections and database activity. So you've got those options to you as well inside PGAdmin. Datagrip dbeaver won't help you with this, but PGAdmin will help you and give you some of those things. The big thing I want to bring up here on activity, the big difference that I had from SQL Server to Postgres was users. Users are very different in how they manage the memory and the usage of it in Postgres versus SQL Server. SQL Server, I had SQL servers that had 3,000 to 5,000 users on it constantly, all day long, every day, over and over again. That was my standard running for SQL Server. Sometimes there was 8,000 to 9,000 users. When I came to Postgres, they're like, we don't want more than 500 users at one time on Postgres. And now it's no more than 1,500 or 2,000. I don't know why. You
mean connections?
Yeah, connections, yeah. Yeah, connections to the database. Yeah, they immediately said, nope, no more than 500. And I was on Postgres 10 at that time. And now in 12 and 13, they're like, no, you can't have more than 1,500, 2,000. We have things like PG Bouncer in place to lower the connections, everything. So it was a big shock to me when I came in and they said, we don't want a lot of connections to the database. That's bad. That's really bad. And I'm like, why? The explanation is that connections inside Postgres hold a certain amount of memory, hold a certain amount of resources, and basically hold that open for that time that the connection is there. A lot of applications out there hold those connections open. They pull them and keep them open. Because they keep that open, that wastes server resources for CPU, memory, and all those other things. So if you put too many connections onto a Postgres instance, you can have problems with resources and memory. So that was one of the big differences between it. SQL Server was a lot more like, no, if the connection's gone for a certain amount of time, it'll just release the memory and the resources, and we don't care so much. So it didn't have as much of a problem. So it was a big difference for me when somebody said connections, connections, connections. And I can tell you right now, in my current company, we watch connections constantly. Even with PG Bouncer, if our connections on some of our servers get up to 1,000 or something more, and the applications are bad for doing this, but if it gets to that point, the servers start to have issues. They have serious issues because we're taking up so much resources on these servers. So connections are a big thing inside the Postgres world, whereas in SQL Server, you didn't see it hardly at all. It was a big surprise for me that those two were different. So the other thing I will mention in here that I kind of put on here, locks, relatively the same. I'm going to make this general statement, relatively the same. They're not drastically different. There's definitely some differences there, but not a ton. Nothing that I feel like is enough to bring down the house on the differences. The wall log, though, is basically the transaction log in SQL Server and the wall log are kind of the same thing, essentially, in a lot of ways. And the problem with the wall log is that you can fill it up. Remember when I said earlier you can sometimes get it to a drive and fill it up? If you have replication scenarios going on and you have things being replicated across, your wall log will fill up if you don't have something reading that replication, something that's pulling it in. And so that's another thing that can bring down the house, essentially, if you fill up your wall log and you don't have something picking that up. So watching that replication and watching what's going on there is very important to what you're doing. And most of the Postgres that I've ran into have some sort of replication going on. A lot of them are followers, so it's not a big deal. It's because followers are usually pretty quick and they don't have wall logs. But logical replication runs into this all the time. A logical server fails, it's still sitting there loading up the wall log saying, please come and pick up this transaction, and it never picks up the transaction. So those sort of things happen a lot. It's something that you need to monitor. A wall log is something you need to monitor that we didn't monitor as much inside a SQL Server situation. I mean, sometimes you ran into transaction log problems in the SQL Server when backups were running long, things like that, but it was a lot more rare. In Postgres, I see it a lot more often that people fill up their wall logs constantly. So, okay, other questions on this one? Doing pretty good on time. You guys can ask more questions, though. So, all right, now let's make it go faster. Let's talk about explain and explain analyze, and let's talk about Management Studio for that, too. So once again, I'm not going to go into the huge in-depth of all the differences in performance tuning between Postgres and SQL Server. I'm going to let Ryan do that on his full day thing, because you could talk about this for hours, okay, and he's going to. But I'm going to show you some of the basics of the key things that you need to know. Once again, in Management Studio, you had that wonderful little button up there that said Show Execution Plan, and you got this great graphical execution plan. And in Postgres, you get this really crappy text plan. And I do mean a really crappy text plan. I love my text plan, don't get me wrong. I know how to read it, I know what to do with it, but it looks like crap compared to a nice big GUI thing that shows you all the paths. And yes, this... What? And PGAdmin has a GUI one now? Okay. Okay, I didn't know about that one. But so once again, Henrietta, so her mention was that PGAdmin has that same button that will show you a GUI plan. And I go back to the statement, how many people use PGAdmin? Okay. A lot of people don't use PGAdmin, and they use pSQL. So a lot of people are used to looking at the explain plan. So the other place that I go for the explain plan, honestly, is I cannot say enough good things about it, is this website right here. Go to Despes' website, put in your explain plan, and you'll get a graphical piece of it. I love this site. I use this a ton when I was getting started and everything else. Every time I wanted to look at explain plan in a better way, I use this to figure it out, okay? So this is a great way to look at your explain plan, especially if you've got a big, complicated explain plan. It's a great way to go in there and take a look at it. It highlights things like the busiest sections or the ones that use the most rows, all sorts of things. So I can't stress this enough. That's a good one to go to. The other key thing on the explain plan really is just that we will have different names. We are used to clustered index scans. We're used to clustered index seeks. We're used to index seeks and things like that. The names are not the same. An index seek isn't such a bad thing in Postgres. I mean, index scan isn't such a bad thing in Postgres versus where in SQL Server it was kind of this big thing that if you were scanning, that was bad. In Postgres, it's not. So it's another one of those terminologies that you really got to get used to, is seek and scan are very different inside these two worlds. And that's something that you're going to have to see. So what I strongly suggest anytime on these is you start playing with explain plans and taking a look at them. There's also a lot of great content out here on how to read explain plans and what to do. We had a session, I think, here at this conference, and then there's been a ton of other sessions. So just go and look those up and then go through the explain plan that way. Just know that what you did before in SQL Server with scans and seeks are not the same as when you go into Postgres now. That's a full, I don't want to say it's a full relearn, but it's definitely a difference in what you're going to look at. And then as far as graphical, PGAdmin or go to Despes. Yes?
I was going to say that the thing that was surprising to me coming over, number one, the number of operators in SQL Server that a query can come up with is probably 4 times. You know, the kinds of iterators they have, things like that. So compared to what's in Postgres, right?
Yeah.
There's actually fairly limited set.
Yeah.
And then the really dumb thing is I used to say like, hey, what about this operator? I would get blank stares and like, you mean a node?
Yeah.
Yes, the node. That's what
The
I
node.
used to like.
Yes,
Okay.
the node. Yeah. I would say that the one thing I do love about the explain plans, the explain analyzes, I've loved heavily is the timings that they give on there. You can really see the difference between rows if you look at the time. In SQL Server, I always said, I had a presentation on this too, look for these big fat arrows and try to find where your data is really going through. With an explain plan, if you can find the time in there, you know what section it's spending its time on, and so then you can ultra focus on that. So I had to translate that though. I had to find what I call my fat arrows in this big text blob, and I'm like, where the heck is this? And I attended a session in Postgres, in the Postgres Open in Florida, and they showed how to do that from the time, and I'm like, that's what I was looking for. That helped me to figure that out. So look for your times to do that similar thing. Okay. Any other questions on explain? Like I said, performance we could go into a lot. The indexes that I put on here, there are, I guess the best way I can put this is that there are more kind of options for indexing in PostgreSQL. Okay, SQL Server is pretty basic on its indexes. It's got these few indexes. And when I say it's basic, it has more options, but you don't see them out in the world. You see a lot of just here's an index and that's it. In Postgres, there are a lot of different types of indexes, gins, gists, all sorts of things. And so there's a lot of different variation in the indexing world in Postgres. And so that's something definitely out there that you should look at. Understanding how to use them in the right situation, it's all a Postgres side of things. It's not a SQL Server side of things. So learn it in Postgres and you'll be okay. Just know that you're going to see words in index creation that you're not used to from a SQL Server world. Like I said, gin, gist, there's the geolocation ones, there's a whole bunch of them. So, okay.
You mentioned Planet Explorer on the slide. I guess there's nothing.
Yeah. So Plan Explorer, that's where I was kind of talking about. There's a lot of other third-party tools out there for SQL Server that you can utilize. Plan Explorer, Sentries, Redgates, all sorts of products out there. There's not a lot of those products in the Postgres world right now, showing by our sponsors. They are definitely getting more of them. And some of the sponsors that are in the Microsoft world are actually coming over to the Postgres world a little bit too to try to put some of those monitoring and those things in place. But there's definitely not a lot of tools out there. When I say there's not a lot of tools out there, it doesn't mean that it's not available. I mean in general use. The Postgres community, it might be there, but are they using it in that way? And right now, what I've seen from my community, from my user group, everything else, they're not using it that way. People go to the Explain Analyze, they look at that, they go to the website, that's it. There's not a lot of tools out there trying to analyze like Plan Explorer or something else. So, excellent point, thank you.
Maybe we need to get Adam Mechanic and Aaron Bertrand and folks like that over to Postgres.
I'm not against that, Ryan, let's have a chat. We got work to do, Ryan. Okay, so this last one is like, okay, you've gone through all these days now, and what should I do? This has been crazy. Postgres is completely different. What should I do in my world? Should I quit? No, of course you shouldn't quit. There's more to it. There's more crazy things that are completely different. And the one I wanted to call out here more than anything else was the config. So once again, as my first experience, I was a SQL Server person. I came over to Linux and Postgres brand new, and they said, well, you have to go to the config to edit that setting. I'm like, where's the config? /c/etc/so. Oh, what? And then you have to open it with Vim. I'm like, what? What is that? So I had to learn all these things kind of at the same time. And it was very daunting when I came over and I saw this for the first time. This is a Postgres config file. So I looked at this and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. This is a lot of stuff. And that's kind of the key thing here is that Postgres keeps, I mean, there are other settings, but a lot of it is in this Postgres config file, okay? So in SQL Server, you were very used to properties, setting a few flags here and there, is enabled, stuff like that. It was all in the GUI. Now it is pretty much in these files, and it's out there in those files. So you have to know where they are and what they're doing and that sort of thing. Now, the nice thing is in PSQL and DataGrip, anything else, you can say show config. It'll start to show you the config. You can see it right there. You can set it in PSQL as well. You do not have to go to the config file. Certain ones you can set, certain ones you can't. But the point is that there's a lot of ways to interact with it, but you really, really need to learn where it is, what's in there, and all the things for it. I've also found that in Postgres, almost everything is kind of server level. You don't really have a lot of schema level things, a lot of database level things. It's all right there. Whereas SQL Server, you can have databases that are a little different than the other databases. They can have different settings, different things about them. Postgres, here you go. It's all in there. And if anybody's astute, this is actually a Postgres 10 config file, so don't complain if it doesn't have some feature that you're looking at in 14. It's an older config file. That was another wonderful thing I learned too. If you upgrade from Postgres 10 to say 14, make sure you get the new featured pieces of the Postgres config file, otherwise they won't be there necessarily. So, but this was a big stretch for me, was learning this config file and learning that there's this big file out there that kind of controls everything, and that's all related to it. So this was an important one to me. The last thing I mentioned in here is where I kind of talked about Linux and the drive differences. I mentioned this at the very beginning. I'm just going to mention this again. Microsoft SQL Server has an OS built inside it. Okay, it is what's known as the SQL Server operating system inside it. It's how it interacts with everything around it. It's memory, CPU, all of that stuff. Postgres has a little bit of that, but it also has most of it is dependent on Linux system. Your memory, your drives, how you interact with them, everything else. It handed that off to Linux. So it is very tightly coupled to the Linux operating system, whereas SQL Server is tightly coupled to its own OS. So you have two very big differences in those things. So keep that in mind anytime you're working with it. That if your Linux is having problems, your Postgres is going to have problems. Whereas SQL Server might be, hey, Windows is having issues, but SQL Server is just fine. And vice versa. You know, Postgres could have problems and cause problems on its Linux system. It's the same thing. But just know that difference between them very well. It's something that you come up to a lot. The same with this drive differences. Like I said, you have mount points in Linux, and in Windows you have drives, essentially. And they're very different. They're not very different. They're the same thing, but very different nomenclature. So keep those in mind as you're using them.
And in SQL, like a big part of it is you can tell it how much RAM to use.
Yeah.
And in Postgres, no.
Yeah.
Try to use whatever out of memory, boom.
It's an excellent point. In SQL Server, you can kind of say, use this much memory on this box. You're not going to use any more, which I'll argue that SQL Server will still go over it because it usually does. But yes, you are trying to set and say resource only use this, whereas in Postgres, it's like, no, I'm going to do whatever. I mean, it shows perfectly that in Linux with Postgres, you can go and kill a process. Like at the command line, if you say kill, you can literally kill a connection. Because in your process list in Linux, all the connections show up. This was a huge thing to me. I was like, on SQL Server, you have to go look at who is active. You have to see inside the database who's there. With Postgres on Linux, you just do a PS list and they're all there. It's like, they're not separated. They're together. They're completely together. So it's a big thing to know that those two are very, very closely kept together. So excellent point on the memory. Thank you. And of course, this picture is my favorite thing. My kids gave me this title for my Father's Day, I believe. So, which anybody that knows all the events I run right now, this is totally true. So, all right. And on the 7th day, we rested. No more database stuff, right? No, that's not true at all. On the 7th day, you figured out you're not going to quit. You're going to make it. You're going to keep doing this. Now what do? You go find your community. That's what you do. You go and figure out where you can get help and assistance. And that answer is in these places. Now, I did not put a link to each one of our Slack, Discords, everything else. I put it on my website, Wright Database Consulting. If you scan that QR code, it'll take you right there to that. I will talk about the community, though, here really quick to say, number one, Slack, to me, is one of my favorites. I use Slack every day on a day-to-day basis, so going to the Postgres Slack, it's just another bar on there. It's really easy to get to. It makes a lot of sense, okay? It's very quick. There's a lot of people answering questions. There's a lot of people in the Slack channel. Discord is a lot less used. It's definitely got a lot of fast answers to it, but at the same time, there's only about 200 or 300 people in it, whereas the Slack channel has like 14,000. So it's a big difference in numbers and things like that. And then the docs, okay? So Postgres community loves their docs. I've been told on more than one occasion, just go read the docs and you'll be fine. I'm not fine just reading the docs, okay? I feel like the docs really need a lot more user experience or how to do this or examples or things like that. So for me, the docs are not always the way that I go to try to figure something out. I go to validate what I'm saying. Like if I'm trying to write a create table and I need to make sure syntax is correct, I go to the docs. If I'm trying to learn how to partition or schema something, or set up a partitioning scheme for something, I go somewhere else. I go to a blog post, I go to something else that someone has taught about it. I don't go to the docs. So that's me personally. You can learn however you need to learn, but the docs are definitely something that's out there that has a lot of really, really good information in it. And they are the gold standard, essentially. The doc is the gold standard. So you can't, that's the one that says, if it says this, it's going to do that. But by all means, hopefully, we also get a lot more blog posts going, a lot more Twitter posts going. Ryan's starting up the SQL Friday event. And so we're going to hopefully start having a lot more blog posts. And I'm hoping that as I put this up next time, we'll have a lot of blog links in here, too, that can say, go look at this person's blog, or look at this blog, and those sort of things. That's my hope, is to continue expanding the community. Okay. Any other questions on community? Okay. That is all I have for you today. Yes, I'm a few minutes late. That is all I have for you today. I'm happy to stay back and answer any questions, but I really appreciate everybody's time. I hope you got something out of this. Thank you very much.
Any questions or comments? You have a couple minutes. So.
Yeah, you can definitely ask questions. I just like to make sure if people need to leave, they can go.